They said the war had ended on the 15th of August, 1945, when the emperor's words crackled through radios in Tokyo. But in bamboo huts on Luzon, and in the jungles of Burma, and in the alleys of Nanjing, the air did not change. It still smelled of mildew and fear. Thin screens trembled in the damp wind. A small group of young women sat close, gripping one another the way shipwrecked people cling to wood. The date meant nothing to them. They knew only boots, shouted orders, the ache of hunger, and the single rule that kept them alive: endure the next arrival. The place was called a comfort station, a gentle phrase hiding a hard truth. It was a prison made of paper and wood. The Japanese Imperial Army built such sites wherever its flags advanced: Shanghai, Manila, Rangoon, Seoul. Later, scholars would argue over the scale. Some spoke of tens of thousands of victims, others of hundreds of thousands. Each number could fill a stadium, yet here each person was a shadow behind a reed mat, waiting for the next command. One girl, only 17, bit her lip until it bled. She had been taken from a Korean village 2 years earlier, told she would work in a factory. Instead, a ship carried her south, and a convoy delivered her here. Her name disappeared into a ledger, replaced by an entry. She would later say her greatest fear was not death, but losing the sound of her mother's voice. That night, she whispered scraps of lullabies in her own tongue, almost too softly to hear above the chorus of cicadas. Nearby, an older Filipina, perhaps 23, sat very still. Malnutrition had etched extra years into her skin. She remembered crouching in tall grass with her younger brother as soldiers swept through their village in 1942. Bayonets flashed. He died where he hid. She was taking. Now her body was an account line. Only her memories escaped the page. She stared at the floor because looking up invited danger, no matter who stood there. Silence had been trained into them. Rules barked in Japanese: obedience, cleanliness, availability. A doctor's inspection once a week left them sore and humiliated. Soldiers filed through in long lines. Americans were near. To women used by one army, another army sounded like the same threat with a different accent. Soldiers meant power. Power meant danger. One voice whispered that Americans were tall and loud, smoking cigars, quick to shoot, quick to laugh. Another repeated a Japanese officer's taunt that the Americans were even more savage, that they would defile any woman they found. The irony was bitter. They were already living the very abuse used as propaganda. Fear does not measure irony. Fear measures survival. Dusk stretched shadows across the cracked boards. The young clutched the older, and the older held no one. Engines rumbled outside. Boots approached, heavier than before, the rhythm unfamiliar. Even the insects seemed to pause. The Korean girl dug her nails into her palms until small crescents of blood bloomed. She pictured a market by a river, roasted chestnuts, the clean scent of soap, her mother's hands. Then she braced herself. Look down, endure, survive. The steps were a ritual she knew too well. The door slid open. Broad silhouettes filled the frame. The women recoiled, pulling shawls tight over thin arms, eyes wide and stunned. The figures stepped inside, carrying square, heavy shapes. No one understood that they were crates of food, not ammunition. The words in the room were English, low and uncertain, musical compared to the clipped orders the women knew. But in that first breath, language did not matter. Uniforms did. Uniforms meant ownership. Their breath quickened, bodies locked. They waited for the cycle to resume. The Americans hesitated. Hollow-eyed women cowered on the floor. The soldiers set the crates down slowly, like men approaching a wild animal that should never have learned to fear people, but had. One pulled a small tin from a pocket and shook it. The rattle said peaches. Another held out a bar of soap, as if it were an offering. The women did not move. They had seen gifts used as bait. Yet the strangers kept a respectful distance, speaking words the women could not grasp, with a cadence that did not carry menace. Confusion thickened.
The soldier fumbled for cigarettes and held them out, meaning comfort, not knowing the gesture echoed a cruel habit from before. Silence throbbed until a tall, red-haired man tried to mime eating, tapping the tin with a knife, pretending to spoon and swallow, grinning with a shy, foolish smile. A flicker crossed one woman's face, not quite laughter, more like a knot loosening. Habit clenched it shut again. Their eyes adjusted to one another. The soldiers took in the bruises, the uneven hair, the hollow cheeks. They muttered in soft shock. One whispered, almost to himself, that these were girls. Another cursed under his breath at the sight of the place. Finally, the youngest, perhaps 15, reached out with shaking hands. She expected a slap, a barked insult, the punishment for reaching. Instead, a soldier set the tin in her palms and stepped back. She clutched it to her chest, eyes darting between the can and the man who had given it. He made no move to close the space. He only nodded once, as if to say, "It is yours." The moment rippled. The older Filipina lifted a hand toward the soap. The soldier placed it gently against her fingers. She lifted it to her face and breathed in, and tears came without noise. Soap, the most ordinary thing, felt like a treasure pulled from another world. More supplies followed, bandages, quinine, powdered milk. None of it fit the script the women had memorized to survive. Soldiers took. They did not give. Yet these men offered and then stood back, as if they could sense the invisible borderlines drawn by trauma. Outside, other units moved through the village, engines growling, voices carrying. Inside, the air held a fragile balance. The strangers kept their hands open and low. The women kept their shoulders tight and their eyes low. Instinct warned that kindness could be a trap, that cruelty would arrive the moment anyone relaxed. Then something almost absurd happened. The red-haired soldier pulled a small harmonica from his pack. He played a clumsy tune. The notes bent and missed, wobbly as a drunk man's steps. The sound startled everyone that medicine at the time could not truly name. Trust did not grow from speeches. It grew from small acts repeated without a demand. A soldier knelt to fix a torn sandal instead of claiming a body. Another sat within sight, whittling a bird from a scrap of wood, and left it without a word. The language of mercy, awkward and slow, began to translate. It said, "Not this time. Not by us. Not ever again." Under the officers who had controlled this place, a weekly check had been a ritual of humiliation. Under the newcomers, actual doctors treated infections, wrapped wounds, and met eyes without trying to own the person behind them. For women handled like livestock, eye contact without demand felt stranger than any weapon. Even then, doubt lingered each night. Footsteps in the corridor made hearts race until they passed. Food was hidden under floorboards because abundance felt like a trick of fate. One survivor would later describe her first taste of peaches in syrup. The sweetness clung to her lips. She wept, not simply for the flavor, but for the shock of being fed for the sake of living, not used for the sake of war. The days that followed were slow, careful, and confusing. Trust did not arrive with a flag.
It arrived in small gestures that asked for nothing in return. The soldiers who had opened those crates came back with medics and carried more supplies. Clean bandages, bitter quinine, powdered milk that dissolved into a thin sweetness. The women watched every move, waiting for the turn, the moment kindness would snap like a trap. It did not. Not that day, not the next. Caution stayed, but it learned to sit beside breath instead of strangling it. One medic spoke gently through an interpreter who fumbled for words. Infections would be treated. Fevers would be brought down. There would be food that did not come as payment for a body. The promises were simple, practical, and unbelievable. The first exams were halting. Hands hovered, then withdrew, then asked permission again. Doctors wrapped wounds and named what they could not heal in a day. Shock, malnutrition, the kind of harm that lives in the nervous system and wakes at every sound. The women did not have a word for it then. Few shared. The harmonica returned, sometimes in tune, often not. A carved wooden bird appeared on a windowsill at dawn, left by the quiet soldier who whittled at night. A repaired sandal, its strap stitched with clumsy care, sat beside a mat. None of this erased the past. It did something humbler. It offered glimpses of a life that was not organized around terror. The women's instincts remained sharp, and rightly so. A raised voice still made shoulders flinch. A sudden knock froze the air. Some hoarded food under mats and behind loose boards. Abundance feels temporary to those who have known only hunger. Others practiced moving without sound, a habit that had kept them alive. The soldiers learned to lower their volume, to set rifles where they could be seen but not felt. They stopped standing in doorways. They waited at thresholds. They asked, and then they waited some more. In that waiting, a new kind of power took root, the power to refrain. Word traveled slowly and then all at once. Outside the hut, an empire had folded. On a day in mid-August, the emperor's voice had reached the nation over the radio for the first time in living memory, speaking in formal words few could fully grasp, and telling his people to accept defeat. The speech was distant news in this small place, but its echo arrived in the form of restraint. Men with authority chose not to use it the old way. That choice changed the air more than any broadcast could. One afternoon, a young Korean girl too weak to stand was lifted onto a stretcher. She wept the entire short walk, not from pain, but because no man had ever carried her without harm. The sensation felt alien, almost unbearable. In the aid post, a nurse dabbed her brow with a clean cloth. The girl gripped the edge of the cot, waiting for the world to turn cruel again. It did not, at least not in that room, at least not that hour. Nearby, the Filipina who had clutched the soap held a fresh bandage as if it were a jewel. It would keep a wound clean. It would not be used as a gag. That difference was everything. Records exist that reduce such moments to lines on a page. They tally malnutrition in rough percentages. Perfect. No army is perfect. But inside these abandoned rooms, for a brief span, restraint held. At night, the women still woke at the scrape of a boot or the creak of a hinge. Startle lived in their bones. Healing would not move faster than the nervous system. The medics kept coming back with clean water and gauze. The harmonica tried another song. The carved bird multiplied into 2, then 3, perched like small, patient witnesses on the sill. The room remained the same size, but the future inside it widened by an inch. Sometimes an inch is the start of a life. History often reduces suffering to columns and totals, but lives do not fit neatly into ledgers. Scholars argue about ranges, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, yet each digit is a single life interrupted, a voice pushed into silence. In the years after liberation, testimonies began to pierce that silence. A Korean woman, still young when taken, stood before cameras decades later and spoke for the first time. She was taken at 17. She said they were treated as less than animals. Her words traveled farther than any report because they carried the weight of breath and memory, not just ink. For every woman who spoke, many could not. Shame and fear buried their stories. But the truth arrived anyway, one voice at a time. Military papers, written in a distant tone, confirmed details no one wanted to read. Interrogators and medics listed venereal infections, forced pregnancies ended, and brutal quotas that demanded each woman endure 15 to 30 men in a single day, sometimes more. The language was dry. The reality was not. Paper measured infections. Paper counted visits. Paper could not register the sound a door makes when it opens for the 20th time before midnight. It could not record the way a body learns to leave itself to survive. In Manila, a Filipina told investigators that she collapsed from exhaustion and woke to a beating meant to push her back to work. She remembered boots more than faces. She said no one looked at them. They were walls. They were objects. She remembered coins dropping into a box outside the door, the sound of payment handed to a system that erased the person who paid the price. Money moved. They had seen firestorms and beach landings. They had not seen a cruelty run like a schedule. Faced with that, many reached for the simplest decency they had. They gave food. They handed over soap. They offered a tune blown through a cheap harmonica. It was clumsy compassion, but it was still compassion. To women who had forgotten such a thing existed, it felt unreal. One survivor said she assumed the soldiers wanted to fatten them before killing them. Only later did she understand that the point was life, not death. Numbers cannot capture the strangeness of tasting peaches in syrup after years of hunger. Imagine a sweetness so sharp it hurts, proof that a mouth can know something besides fear. Imagine the clean scent of soap rising from a bar given without a demand attached. These are small things. In a ruined world, small things can remake a person's sense of what is possible. Mistrust did not vanish just because mercy appeared. When medics tried to separate the sick for treatment, panic erupted. Separation had always meant harm. Doctors described the women's condition in the terms available at the time: shock, nerves, exhaustion. Language too thin for wounds that lived in bone and breath. Today, many would call it trauma that persists, the kind that wakes a person at the scrape of a boot and forces them to hide tins of food in corners, certain that plenty is a trick that ends at dawn. Still, some moments remade the world by an inch. A girl too weak to walk was lifted on a stretcher, and she cried not from pain, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being carried without violence. Another stared at a clean bandage in her hands as if it were a gem. Cloth had touched her skin before, only to restrain or to gag. Now it meant healing. The difference between those two meanings is the size of a life. Records from that period listed malnutrition in broad majorities and infections in more than half, scars on almost everyone. Commanders, who measured war in ships sunk and sorties flown, were forced to reckon with a different ledger: civilians brutalized by a machine that called them necessary. A Japanese officer once claimed the system maintained discipline. To those who found the rooms after the surrender, the system that line. The world is complicated. Mercy, when it appears, does not erase what came before, and it never licenses denial. It marks a possibility. It says the cycle can be broken, here, now, by someone who chooses restraint over power. As days stretched into weeks, the women learned to live inside that possibility. Startle did not leave. Night sounds still turned breath to stone. But a few things changed shape. A door could open without a command behind it. A hand could offer without taking. A tune could fill a room without demanding anything in return. The future did not arrive as a parade. It arrived as a narrow path, barely wider than a footstep. For those who had been trained to expect only harm, that path was almost impossible to step onto. And yet, step by careful step, they did. The war ended, but peace did not arrive with it. When the soldiers moved on and the huts emptied, many survivors stepped into a world that did not know how to see them. Some went home and found doors half closed. Poverty pressed hard. Gossip pressed harder. A mother might whisper about neighbors and shame. A daughter, alive but diminished in other people's eyes, learned that survival did not guarantee welcome. The word ruined followed like a shadow. It stuck to the back of a name. It stained futures that had barely begun. Others tried to disappear into ordinary life. A market stall, a basket of fruit, a place where a girl had once walked as a child. Yet whispers trailed every step. Men stared. Women crossed the street. Children repeated insults they did not understand. Acts of mercy became hard to mention, not because they were untrue, but because kindness itself reminded people of the wound. Communities eager to rebuild could not bear a living reminder of what could not be rebuilt with wood and stone. Still, voices rose, slowly, bravely, and often late. Decades after liberation, women began to speak in public. A Korean survivor, taken at 17, stood before cameras and told the truth in a simple line. They were treated as less than animals. That voice broke a dam. Others followed. Each testimony opened a space that did not exist before it was spoken. Museums and memorials of not a single feeling. It was fractured, unequal, and dependent on the room, the hour, the person who crossed the threshold. Justice, when it finally took a stage, did not always invite them onto it. Courtrooms far away focused on other crimes and larger strategies. The system that had caged them was mentioned in passing, if at all. Few faced punishment for building and running the stations. For many women, the refusal to remember them in public life became a second injury. A mercy offered in a hut in the days after surrender was real. A refusal to honor their truth in the decades that followed was just as real. Memory did not give up. It traveled in scents and sounds. A tin of peaches, opened years later, could call forth tears before the lid was fully off. The syrup's sweetness felt like a message delivered across time. Someone once wanted you to live. The smell of soap could become a doorway to a moment when a hand offered and did not take. A clumsy tune from a small harmonica could sit in the chest like a light that refuses to go out. These details were not small to the people who held them. They were anchors. Mercy remained complicated. Some survivors admitted that restraint unsettled them almost as much as cruelty. After years of conditioning, kindness felt like camouflage. The doubt took time to fade, if it faded at all. Only when days turned into weeks without violation did the new pattern begin to hold. The realization was painful in its own way. If restraint was possible here, then the system that came before had been a choice, not a necessity. Power could have refrained. It had chosen not to. Arguments about legacy multiplied in classrooms, courtrooms, and public squares. Some emphasized the shock of the women. Others pointed to the discipline shown by certain units at a particular moment. Critics reminded anyone who would listen that no army is spotless, that wrong was done elsewhere, that discipline is a line drawn by people who can choose to cross it. All of these statements could be true at once. Inside those rooms, during those first days after surrender, uniforms entered and did not claim the bodies inside. That fact sits beside every other fact. Neither canceling nor excusing came after. To listen, to look directly, to tell what was heard without trimming the edges for comfort. As age thinned the ranks of survivors, their demands did not soften. Recognition, apology, repair that was more than words. Governments issued statements and then revised them. Committees met. Textbooks changed a line, then changed it back. Yet the voices that had once been silenced kept speaking. They repeated a truth as simple as air. A person is not a number. A life is not a column on a page. Mercy is not an eraser, and silence is not peace. What remains is a question that will not leave. If mercy could appear in a room where cruelty had been organized like a timetable, what will be done with the stories of those who witnessed it? Will that narrow path, restraint chosen over power, widen into justice, or close beneath the weight of forgetfulness? The answer is not guaranteed. It never is. But it is chosen, one decision at a time, the way a hand can choose to offer soap instead of a fist, the way a voice can choose to tell the whole truth, even when it is easier to look away.